At its peak, Royal Doulton employed 7,000 workers across 18 factories in Stoke-on-Trent. The Nile Street works in Burslem was the crown jewel. 1,800 people producing hand-painted bone china collected by royalty, exported to 80 countries, carried by a name that had meant quality since 1815. Then the decisions began. Institutional investors blocked the American acquisition that might have saved it. A new chairman arrived from Edinburgh 1 day a week. Production was shipped to a factory in Indonesia, where the monthly wage was less than a single week's pay in Burslem. The site was sold to a developer before the workers were even told. Today, the factory is a housing estate called Kiln Gate, an apartment block named Doulton House. No museum, no kilns, no clay dust in the air. This is the story of a £100 investment that became a royally warranted empire, and the decade in which 6 generations of craft were exchanged for a spreadsheet. Not through war or disaster, but through reasonable decisions made by people who never had to live with the consequences. Chapter 1. £100. The story begins where so many British industrial stories begin, with a man who had almost nothing, risking all of it. In 1815, a 22-year-old pot thrower named John Doulton counted out his life savings. £100. Every penny he'd earned since completing his apprenticeship at the Fulham Pottery, one of the oldest commercial stoneware works in England, founded by master potter John Dwight in 1688. Doulton had learned his trade there from boyhood, not just throwing pots, but visiting customers, breaking the clay with hammers, mixing constituents, firing the kilns. He knew the business inside out, and by the time he finished his training, he'd earned a reputation as one of the best pot throwers in London. He used that £100 to buy into a tiny existing pottery at Vauxhall Walk, Lambeth, in South London. His partners were Martha Jones, a widow who'd inherited the pottery from her late husband, and John Watts, the foreman. They traded as Jones, Watts and Doulton. The operation was barely a business. 1 kiln, about a dozen staff. They made utilitarian salt-glazed stoneware, blacking bottles, oil bottles, stone jars, jugs for inns and pubs, gallipots for ointments, bottles for chemicals, topical political ceramics bearing the heads of Lord Grey and Lord Brougham. Humble work. There was nothing decorative or fine about any of it, but Doulton was relentless. A contemporary account records that he would often make 200 2-gallon bottles in a single day. After canvassing for orders and collecting money in the morning, he'd frequently throw a quantity of 5-gallon cans in the afternoon. He was, in the language of the day, a complete potter, a man who could do every job in the works, from breaking raw clay to selling the finished product. Martha Jones withdrew from the partnership in 1820, the dissolution recorded in the London Gazette. The firm became Doulton and Watts. By 1826, growing demand forced a move to larger premises on Lambeth High Street. Watts remains a shadowy figure. Almost nothing is known about his personal life, his birth, or death dates. He retired quietly in 1853. And on the 1st of January 1854, the Doulton family consolidated their 3 separate businesses into a single partnership, Doulton and Company, with combined capital of £51,682. Here's the detail that tells you where the future already lay. Henry Doulton's sanitary pipe business, established only in 1846, contributed over £33,000 to that combined capital, more than 3 times the value of the long-established Doulton and Watts pottery at roughly £9,800. The son's enterprise had already eclipsed the father's. The unglamorous work of draining London's sewage was worth more than generations of stoneware. John Doulton died on 26th of May 1873, leaving an estate valued at approximately £80,000, a fortune built from that single £100 gamble. He died 4 years before his son was knighted by the Queen, 28 years before the company was granted the right to call itself Royal. He never saw the name that would outlive him by 2 centuries. Chapter 2. The boy who was meant for the church. Of John Doulton's 8 children, the one who transformed the family trade into an empire was the one nobody expected. Henry Doulton, born on the 25th of July 1820 at Vauxhall Walk, was described as the most academic of the children. His parents wanted him for the church or the law. They sent him to University College School on Gower Street at 13, where he developed a love of literature that never left him. His father thought Henry the least likely of all his children to join the family business. In 1835, aged 15, Henry chose the pottery. Nobody quite understood why, but within 2 years he could throw a 20-gallon chemical receiver, a feat requiring exceptional strength and precision, the kind of skill that took most potters a decade to master. He was scholarly, experimental, socially restless. He was elected permanent chair of the Lambeth Debating Society in 1849 and joined the Society of Arts in 1851. His company motto, the phrase he repeated to workers and managers alike, was 4 words long: full kilns and empty yards. The pivotal moment of Henry's career had nothing to do with fine china. It came in 1845, when Edwin Chadwick, later called the father of sanitary science, personally persuaded Henry to manufacture stoneware drainage pipes. London's sewers were a catastrophe. Porous brick channels that leaked raw sewage into the water supply, spreading cholera and typhoid through the city's poorest districts. Chadwick needed pipes that wouldn't leak. Henry built a dedicated pipe factory at Lambeth, on what became the Albert Embankment, and produced the first circular ceramic sewage pipes in the world. The timing was extraordinary. The cholera pandemic of 1846 to 1860 and Dr. John Snow's legendary tracing of the 1854 Broad Street outbreak to sewage-contaminated water created explosive demand for Doulton's pipes. By 1854, the builder reported that Doulton manufactured 1/5 of the pipe sewers made throughout the country, at the rate of 10 miles of sewer a week. Henry introduced a steam-driven potter's wheel that put the company ahead of its competitors by roughly a decade. Additional factories opened at St Helens in Lancashire and Dudley in the West Midlands. The man who would build a ceramic empire started by making Britain's sewers work. But Henry wasn't content with infrastructure. From 1866, he established a connection with the Lambeth School of Art, directed by John Sparks, and began hiring art students to create unique signed pieces of decorative stoneware. The first and greatest of these was George Tinworth, a greengrocer's son from Walworth, so poor he'd pawned his overcoat to pay for evening art classes. Tinworth became known as the Rembrandt in terracotta. He executed commissions including a crucifixion altarpiece for York Minster. He was so socially isolated, unable by all accounts to relate to his fellow workers, that he died in 1913 on his daily rail journey to the Lambeth Works, alone on a train heading to the job he'd held for nearly 50 years. And then there were the women. Henry Doulton employed women in large numbers, unusual for the period, remarkable for the pottery industry. Hannah Barlow, daughter of a bank manager bankrupted by sudden death, joined in 1871 and became famous for her sgraffito animal designs incised into soft clay. Her sister Florence followed in 1873, specialising in patte-sur-patte bird studies. By the 1880s, the Lambeth studio employed more than 300 artists, mainly young women. The employment of women and the positive working conditions offered by the factory became renowned across the industry. Henry Doulton was appointed potter to the Prince of Wales in 1886. He received the Albert Medal of the Royal Society of Arts in 1885. Previous recipients included Tennyson and Rowland Hill. On the 12th of August 1887, Queen Victoria knighted him as part of her Golden Jubilee celebrations, making him the first potter in history to receive a knighthood. He died on the 17th of November 1897, aged 77. 4 years later, in 1901, King Edward VII granted the royal warrant to the Burslem factory. Henry's son, Henry Lewis Doulton, accepted the honour with what was described as a great sense of pride for his family's achievements, and a bitter sense of regret that his father had passed away before he could accept it himself. The knighthood, the royal warrant, the name that would travel the world, all of it rested on a foundation of sewage pipes. The unglamorous infrastructure of the Victorian sanitary revolution funded the artistic ambitions that followed, and the greatest of those ambitions was already taking shape 150 miles to the north. Chapter 3. In their view, we Southerners know nothing about potting. In 1877, Henry Doulton invested £12,000 to purchase a share in Pinder, Bourne and Company, an established earthenware manufacturer at Nile Street, Burslem, the very heart of the Staffordshire Potteries. To understand what that meant, you need to understand what Burslem was. The oldest of the 6 towns that would become Stoke-on-Trent, recorded in the Domesday Book as Burslem, Burslem was the birthplace of the English pottery industry. By 1710, 35 pot banks were already operating within its borders. By 1785, the wider potteries employed 20,000 people across 200 works, with roughly 1,000 bottle kilns sending smoke into the Staffordshire sky. The great names were already royalty here. Wedgwood, founded 1759, Spode, around 1770, Minton's, 1793. Josiah Wedgwood had built the largest factory in Britain at Etruria, near Burslem, in 1769. Josiah Spode II had standardised the bone china formula, still used worldwide. Henry Doulton was an outsider, a London stoneware man. The Staffordshire potters looked at him with deep scepticism. Henry reportedly remarked, "In their view, we Southerners know little about God and nothing at all about potting. The partnership with Shadford Pinder wasn't a success. Money was unwisely spent. Differences of opinion caused such a rift that only arbitration could resolve the matter." Pinder accepted a settlement and retired in 1882. The business was reconstituted as Doulton & Company, Burslem, and Henry set about proving the Staffordshire men wrong. He appointed John Slater as art director and John Cuthbert Bailey as factory manager. Bailey was just 23, described as an inspired appointment. He would work for the company his entire career. Bone china production commenced at Nile Street in 1884, and something remarkable began to happen. The London Outsiders factory started producing work that rivaled the best in the potteries. By 1904, the Nile Street works employed over 1,200 people. Arnold Bennett, born in nearby Hanley in 1867, grew up in Burslem and fictionalised it as Bursley in his Five Towns novels. He described the town as tall chimneys and rounded ovens, schools, the new Scarlet Market, the grey tower of the old church, all netted in flowing scarves of smoke. That smoke came from the bottle kilns, the distinctive hourglass-shaped structures that consumed at least 10 tons of coal per firing, with large ovens using over 30. They were the skyline of the Potteries. J.B. Priestley, visiting in 1934, described a fantastic collection of narrow-necked jars or bottles peeping above the housetops on every side. An earlier visitor recorded a heterogeneous mass of hovels and palaces, farmhouses and factories, chapels and churches, canals and coal pits, pervaded with suffocating smoke. This was the world Doulton had entered, and within a generation, the Outsiders factory at Nile Street had become its crown jewel. Chapter 4. By Candlelight in the Convent. The man who turned Nile Street into a creative powerhouse arrived from Royal Worcester in 1889, carrying a portfolio and a restless ambition. Charles Noak was born in 1858 and had trained as a modeller at Worcester before joining Doulton at Burslem. He would become art director in 1914 and hold the post until 1936, but his influence began long before the title. Noak was an inventor of products. In 1904, he developed rouge flambe, a dramatic red and black glaze achieved through reduction firing, whose secret formula was known to only 3 or 4 people at any given time. When those people left, the formula went with them. It was knowledge held in human hands, not written in manuals. In 1913, Noak launched the HN figurine series, the product line that would define Royal Doulton for the rest of the century. The initials stood for Harry Nixon, the figure painting manager who oversaw the painstaking hand decoration of every piece. The origin of the series carried its own small drama. King George V and Queen Mary visited the Nile Street works, and the Queen picked up one of the trial figurines and called it a little darling. She ordered copies for the palace, The first figurine in the series was named Darling, HN1. Over 4,000 different HN models would be manufactured in the decades that followed. 2 decades later, in 1934, Noke launched character jugs with John Barleycorn and Old Charlie, ceramic portraits of British archetypes that became collector obsessions. And that same year, factory manager Cuthbert Bailey produced what may be the most unlikely origin story in British manufacturing. Bailey's daughter, Barbara Vernon Bailey, was a nun. Sister Mary Barbara, living in a Sussex convent, had a talent for drawing. Her father commissioned her to create designs for a children's nursery wear range. She drew the designs by candlelight, late at night in her convent cell, showing rabbits in everyday human activities: cooking, gardening, reading, going to school. The father bunnies were modelled after her own pipe-smoking, spectacle-wearing father. The mother bunnies wore blue in honour of Our Lady. Bunnykins was an instant success. It was used by Princesses Elizabeth and Margaret. It became a staple christening gift across Britain and the Commonwealth. One of Royal Doulton's most iconic product lines, designed by a nun, by candlelight, in a convent, in secret. But the figurines and character jugs and bunnykins all depended on the same thing: the hands of the workers inside Nile Street. And to understand what was eventually lost, you have to understand what that work actually involved. A Royal Doulton bone china figurine began as raw materials, bone ash from calcined cattle bones making up roughly 40 to 45%, Cornish china clay at 25 to 30%, and feldspar at 25 to 30%. These were ground and mixed with water to create liquid slip, which was poured into plaster moulds, complex, multi-part moulds for elaborate pieces, with heads, arms, and flowing skirts cast separately. The plaster absorbed moisture, forming a thin wall of clay against the mould's inner surface. Excess slip was drained. Green wares were left to dry, then fettled, trimmed of seams with small knives, and sponged smooth by hand. Then came the biscuit firing. Temperatures of 1200 to 1300 degrees Celsius, sustained for 15 hours or more. The pieces shrank by roughly 20%. And here was the brutal arithmetic of bone china. Approximately 20 to 30% of items cracked or broke at this stage. 1 in 4 or 5 destroyed. An extraordinary attrition rate that meant every surviving piece carried the cost of its fallen siblings. Survivors were glazed by spraying or hand dipping, then subjected to a second firing. The glossed firing, at roughly 1,000 to 1,150 degrees, fusing the glaze into a smooth, impermeable surface. Hand painting came next, or transfer printing, or gilding, each fixed by a third firing at 825 degrees. Colours changed unpredictably during firing. A blue that looked perfect going in might emerge as grey. A red could burn to black. It required years of trial and error mastery, knowledge held in the eye and the wrist, not in any textbook. Every piece was inspected at every stage. Imperfections meant rejection. The painting studios were long, well-lit rooms where paintresses worked at benches, applying polychrome enamel decoration to figurines and tableware with brushes so fine they held only a few hairs. The work demanded patience and a very steady hand. Each paintress was assigned a number, allowing individual work to be traced across decades, a signature system that made every woman personally accountable for the quality of her brushstrokes. Women were the backbone of the decoration departments. They represented nearly half the workforce in the Stoke-on-Trent potteries at the beginning of the 20th century, though men tenaciously guarded their positions as painters and gilders and even prevented women from using gold and armrests. Deliberate restrictions designed to keep them from the fine, lucrative work. At Nile Street, women formed the core of the figurine painting and decoration teams. They were the hands that gave Royal Doulton its beauty, and some of them spent entire lifetimes inside those walls. Percy Curnock entered the Nile Street factory in 1885 and retired only in 1954. Nearly 70 years of service, specialising in floral painting, especially roses. Robert Allen entered as an apprentice while quite a boy, attending the old Wedgwood Institute for art instruction. He was speedily picked out by art director John Slater as a promising artist and rose to become Slater's right-hand man. His obituary recorded that he poured out his soul in the interests of pottery decoration. Herbert Betterley joined in 1886 after study at the Burslem School of Art, painting intricate gold patterns on ornamental ware until 1930. Multi-generational employment was the norm at Nile Street. Charles J. Noakes served as art director from 1914 to 1936. His son Cecil Jack Noakes succeeded him. Peggy Davies, born in 1915 within walking distance of the works, whose grandfather had been an engineer in a local pot bank, joined as a modeller and stayed for 4 decades. She created over 250 figurines, making her Royal Doulton's most prolific designer. Her 3 sons posed for child figures. Her husband appeared as the master and the town crier. When the company pressured her into producing typical Victorian ladies, she rebelled and produced a Regency-style figure called Minuet. She wasn't satisfied to simply follow in others' footsteps. Mary Nicol, Doulton's leading character figure modeller from 1954, was described as a very versatile artist with a discerning eye for detail. She was so prolific that many of her designs weren't produced during her lifetime. She died at 52 in 1974, another career consumed entirely by the work at Nile Street. The figure painting department grew from Harry Nixon's initial team to 10 artists by 1927, and 27 figure painters by the late 1930s. Workers were typically paid piecework, per piece completed, which increased take-home pay but meant breakages and failures came directly out of wages. You carried the cost of every mistake your hands made. The factory itself sprawled across roughly 11 to 15 acres of Burslem, a rambling complex of multi-storey red brick buildings stretching along Nile Street, with entrances on Nile Street and Zion Street. Doulton had expanded over decades by constructing new buildings and acquiring neighbouring factories, including the Kilncroft in Chapel Lane and the Sylvester Pottery on the corner of Nile Street and Sylvester Street. The Holy Trinity Church, built in 1851 in Gothic style, stood immediately adjacent. It was demolished in 1959 due to subsidence, and the site became a car park for Doulton's visitors and factory shop. A 1907 business guide to the neighbourhood documents the world around those gates. Grocers, tobacconists, a clogger, a fish and tripe dealer, pubs, the Blue Ball, the Crown and Anchor, the Durham Ox. Famous postcards from around 1900 survive showing workers streaming out of the factory gates at home time. Hundreds of men and women flooding the streets during lunch hours and at shift's end, spending money and sustaining the town's small businesses. This was the daily pulse of Burslem, a community whose rhythm was set by the works hooter. But the conditions inside a Staffordshire pottery were an assault on the body. The air was thick with clay dust, flint dust, and coal ash. Near the kilns, the heat was suffocating, temperatures reaching 1300 degrees Celsius during biscuit firing, each cycle lasting over 72 hours. Even after 48 hours of cooling, the men retrieving wares sometimes had to enter while temperatures were still dangerously high. Potter's rot, silicosis, was rampant, caused by inhaling fine silica dust. A study of 106 pottery workers found 55% had at least some stage of the disease. Lead poisoning from glaze mixtures caused dropped wrist and dropped ankle. In severe cases, paralysis or epilepsy. Over 400 cases of lead poisoning were reported among British potters in 1897 alone. The dippers, those who immersed ware in lead-based glaze, were the highest paid workers in the factory, precisely because of the danger. A dipper had a life expectancy of about 40 years. The beauty of the finished china was built on bodies, and yet, as one account put it, the people of the Potteries had a strong character, cheerful, friendly, and with great pride in the products of their district. They ate Staffordshire oatcakes, thin, bubbly, oatmeal-based pancakes with cheese, bacon and sausage, described as the staple diet of pottery workers in the 19th century. They ate lobby, a hearty stew. They spoke in a distinct Potteries dialect, H-dropping, words like nesh, for feeling the cold. Working-class Methodism was the dominant religion. John Wesley himself had visited regularly between 1760 and 1790. This was a community that knew what it made, knew what it was worth, and carried that knowledge in its bones. During the Second World War, Doulton produced undecorated canteen ware for the armed forces under the wartime concentration scheme. Charles Noak created a Winston Churchill loving cup stamped with the words, "This loving cup was made during the Battle of Britain as a tribute to a great leader." The Burslem factory was the first British pottery to be bombed in October 1940. A 3-story warehouse was destroyed. Production continued. You didn't stop work because someone dropped a bomb on you. Not in Burslem. Chapter 5. Full kilns and empty yards. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Royal Doulton had reached the summit. Nile Street alone employed 1,800 people. Across 18 factories in North Staffordshire, the broader Royal Doulton tableware group employed 7,000 workers. The HN figurine series had grown to thousands of models, collected obsessively around the world. Character jugs lined the shelves of antique shops from Melbourne to Montreal. Bunnykins was a household name. The company held royal warrants, operated in 80 countries, maintained distribution subsidiaries in Hong Kong and Tokyo, and ran over 400 retail branches worldwide. The specific years representing the absolute peak as a manufacturing enterprise were approximately 1993 to 1996, under CEO Stuart Lyon's CBE. Annual turnover exceeded £250 million. Profit stood at £17.6 million. Dividends grew 13% annually. The company had been spun off from the Pearson Group in December 1993 and listed on the London Stock Exchange at a market capitalisation of roughly £150 to £200 million. Lyons had spent £10 million annually between 1987 and 1990 on factory automation. He was negotiating the acquisition of a large and profitable retail group in the United States, a deal he believed would secure Royal Doulton's future for a generation. This was a company that appeared to be thriving. Royal warrants, a loyal collector base spanning continents, confident expansion plans. The name Royal Doulton carried a weight of heritage and quality that 2 centuries of work had earned. And in 1995, while profits were strong and the share price healthy, the company quietly commissioned a new factory just outside Jakarta, Indonesia, at Tangerang, in Western Java. Production began in 1996. It was presented as a supplement to UK manufacturing, producing casual tableware for the American and Japanese markets where fine china sales were softening. A sensible diversification, a hedge against currency risk. Nothing more. Nobody announced that this factory was the mechanism by which every job in Stoke-on-Trent would eventually be eliminated. The infrastructure for the destruction of Nile Street was built during what appeared to be the company's golden hour. Henry Doulton's motto had been full kilns and empty yards, meaning keep the production running, keep the output flowing, don't let stock sit idle. By the mid-1990s, the kilns at Nile Street were full, the yards were busy, the order books were healthy, the name still meant something in every country where people set a table. But 12,000 miles away, in the humid heat of Western Java, a new factory was warming up. And the people sitting at their benches in Burslem, the paintresses, the fettlers, the gilders, the dippers, the women whose mothers and grandmothers had walked through those same gates, had no idea that the end had already been commissioned. Chapter 6. The ground shifts. The tableware market was transforming beneath Royal Doulton's feet, and the company barely noticed. Consumer tastes were moving away from formal bone china dinner services. The 12-place settings in matching patterns, boxed in tissue paper, given as wedding presents, and displayed in glass-fronted cabinets. A younger generation didn't want them. They wanted casual, mix-and-match dining. They wanted colour and informality, and plates they could put in the dishwasher without wincing. The aspirational wedding list market, once the bedrock of fine china sales, was shrinking year on year. Couples asked for holidays and kitchen appliances. The bone china dinner service, the product that had sustained the Staffordshire Potteries for generations, was losing its place in British life. Competition from China was devastating. Paul Farrelly, the Member of Parliament for Newcastle-under-Lyme, reported in Parliament what the industry already knew. Weeks after Royal Doulton produced new designs, professional salesmen from Chinese industrial complexes were going around Europe with portfolios of copies, marketed at a third or a quarter of the price. You couldn't compete with that. Not from a Victorian factory in Burslem, paying British wages. Between 1983 and 2004, ceramics employment in North Staffordshire fell from 50,000 to fewer than 10,000. An industry that had defined a city for 2 centuries was hemorrhaging, a rate that should have terrified anyone paying attention. Sterling's strength against the dollar and yen hurt exports then. The 1997 Asian financial crisis damaged key markets in the Far East. The 2001 recession depressed luxury spending across Europe and America. And yet, and this is the detail that matters, other Stoke-on-Trent companies survived the same conditions. Mark Fisher, the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central, pointed this out in the 2004 parliamentary debate. Dudson, Steelite and Spode, he said, not only survive, but thrive in the same market. The industry wasn't inherently doomed. The difference was management. The Nile Street Works, for all its heritage, was an ageing, rambling complex of buildings expanded piecemeal over more than a century. The company carried 48,000 product lines and 320 tableware patterns, evidence of a business that had lost strategic focus entirely. Design to market time was a disastrous 2 years, in a consumer market that demanded 6 months or less. And the Pearson Group, which had acquired Doulton in 1971, had been losing interest since the late 1980s, refocusing on media properties. The Financial Times, Penguin Books, Pearson Education. The spin-off in December 1993 left Royal Doulton without the financial backing and strategic patience of a major conglomerate. Exposed and alone on the stock market. Vulnerable to exactly the kind of short-term thinking that would destroy it. The clouds were gathering. The question was whether the people running the company could see them, or whether they were too busy counting the dividends to look up. Chapter 7. Short-termism and lack of vision. The decision that killed Royal Doulton wasn't made in Burslem. It was made in the City of London by people who had never set foot on the Nile Street factory floor. In 1997, CEO Stuart Lyons was negotiating an agreed acquisition of a large and profitable retail group in the United States. The target's identity was never publicly revealed. It remains one of the frustrating gaps in this story, a ghost deal whose name was buried with the negotiations. What is known is that the full board supported it. Lyons believed it would secure the company's future by giving Royal Doulton direct access to the American consumer at retail level, bypassing the department stores and third-party distributors who controlled margins and shelf space. 2 institutional investors blocked it. M&G and Mercury Asset Management, holding 25% of Royal Doulton's equity between them, refused to provide shareholder backing. They were concerned about acquisition risk. They preferred short-term returns over an expensive overseas expansion. It was, by the logic of the city, a perfectly reasonable decision. Protect the dividend. Minimize risk. Don't bet the company on an American adventure. The failed bid cost Royal Doulton £1.6 million in advisors' fees. Stuart Lyons resigned in May 1997 rather than preside over a strategy he had no confidence in. The share price stood at approximately £2.50. It would eventually fall to 3 pence. Conservative MP Michael Fabricant, who later delivered the most forensic critique of Royal Doulton's decline in Parliament, identified this moment as the turning point. He called M&G and Mercury Asset Management destructive forces, forces of short-termism and lack of vision. He added simply, "It was a tragedy for the people of Stoke-on-Trent." Lyons had delivered 12 consecutive years of substantial profits. His departure triggered management chaos at the worst possible moment. His successor, Patrick Wenger, a 37-year company veteran who understood the business from the inside, was involved in a serious automobile accident in Australia in November 1998 that ended his career. Within 18 months, Royal Doulton had lost the CEO who'd built the modern company and the successor who might have steadied it. The ship was without a captain, and the storm was already visible on the horizon. Chapter 8. Lions. Led by donkeys. Into the vacuum stepped two men whose names the workers of Nile Street would come to know well. Hamish Grosart was appointed non-executive chairman in May 1998. An Edinburgh financial establishment figure, whom Michael Fabricant described as a privileged scion of a city family and Edinburgh's financial elite. He held 6 other directorships simultaneously. He was rarely seen or noticed at Royal Doulton's headquarters in Stoke-on-Trent. His salary was between £120,000 and £127,000 per annum, for what Paul Farrelly MP called a one-day week. Wayne Nutbean had worked for Waterford Wedgwood from 1988 to 1996 before being hired to run Royal Doulton's Australian subsidiary. He'd been in the same car accident as Patrick Wenger. He became Chief Operating Officer in January 2000, then effectively Chief Executive. After Wenger's accident, Grosart was forced into an acting Chief Executive role, a financial man running a pottery company from Edinburgh 1 day a week. In December 1998, he announced a restructuring that cut 1,200 jobs. 1/5 of the remaining workforce gone. Warehouses consolidated. Temporary factory closures. A write-down of inventory. Closure of underperforming retail outlets. Restructuring charges totalled £47.7 million. On paper, the logic was sound. The company was hemorrhaging cash. Losses reached £45 million in 1998. £34.6 million in 1999. Radical surgery was required. Grosart aimed to reduce product lines from 48,000 to fewer than 20,000. He sold off Royal Crown Derby in June 2000 for £16.5 million, then Caithness Glass in 2001, then the head office building. The design, marketing and retailing teams worldwide were dismantled. But here was the problem. Instead of investing in the brand, in the products, the innovation, the capability that made Royal Doulton worth buying in the first place, the restructuring stripped out the very things that made the company valuable. MPS accused the new management of having publicly belittled the company and then wondered why the company's sales went into freefall. You cannot announce to the world that your business is broken and then act surprised when customers lose confidence. Revenue collapsed. From £252 million in 1997 to £138 million in 2003. The share price fell from £2.50 to below 10 pence. Geoffrey Bagnall, General Secretary of CATU, the Ceramic and Allied Trades Union, launched a scathing public attack. He called management destructive and incompetent, arrogant and complacent. He described the £12.4 million loss in 2001 as a shattering blow. And he found the phrase that would define the whole sorry episode. Lions, he said, led by donkeys. George Stevenson, the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent South, told the Sentinel in October 2002. Their management plan is clearly not working. I believe management, which is not prepared to look at its domestic and international strategy when it has clearly failed, is not up to the job. The chairman and chief executive are responsible. Paul Farrelly confronted Grosart directly at the Royal Doulton AGM. He voted against management as a shareholder. It made no difference. And while the restructuring was stripping out capability in Stoke-on-Trent, the factory in Indonesia was quietly expanding. From 2002, production of Royal Albert was transferred from the Baddeley Green factory, 500 jobs lost. A rights issue that year was specifically identified as enabling Doulton to switch production to Indonesia. From 2004, production of Royal Doulton figurines was transferred to Thailand to a separate factory employing 2,200 artists. By 2009, the Indonesian factory at Tangerang employed 1,500 people producing 5 to 7 million pieces annually. A second factory was built with capacity for 22.5 million pieces per year. The wage differential told the whole story. Indonesian workers were paid an average of £72 per month. Stoke-on-Trent workers earned £260 per week. Once the calculation was made, the outcome was inevitable. As potworker Tony Blore, who spent 16 years at various Royal Doulton factories before being made redundant in 2002, put it, once the management realised they could manufacture cheaper in Indonesia, it was just as if we were fodder. Collectors and dealers reported what the spreadsheets couldn't capture. Australian dealers described Asian-produced Beswick figurines as substandard rubbish. A former Royal Doulton retail operator recalled something worse. I can't count the number of times that we had a counter full of carefully chosen dishes, only to have the customer turn a dish over, see Made in Indonesia, and walk away in disgust. The hands that had spent decades learning how colours changed in the kiln, how to hold a brush with 3 hairs on it steady enough to paint an eyelash on a figurine 4 inches tall. Those hands were being replaced by a factory floor 12,000 miles away where the monthly wage was less than a single week's pay in Burslem. Chapter 9. The End. On the 26th of March 2004, Royal Doulton announced the closure of the Nile Street factory. 525 jobs to be transferred to Indonesia. But the announcement wasn't the beginning. It was the confirmation of something the workers already suspected, and the company had already arranged. Before any announcement, before any consultation with the union, Royal Doulton had agreed a land sale for the factory site with St Modwen, a Birmingham-based property developer. The site was worth more as development land than as a pottery works. The deal was done before the people who worked there were told their jobs were finished. Workers heard the rumours on BBC Radio Stoke and Signal Radio on a Friday. They were sitting at their benches, paintresses with brushes in their hands, fettlers trimming seams from green ware, gilders laying gold onto rims they'd been decorating for 20-30 years. They heard it on the radio. Wayne Nutbean denied that a closure decision had been taken, while workers were already hearing the news, while the land had already been sold. Katu accused the company of blatantly ignoring its statutory obligation to consult workers. The accusation was precise and damning. You don't sell the ground beneath people's feet and then claim you haven't decided to close the building. Joan Whalley, the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent North, led a Westminster Hall debate on the 27th of April 2004. She said something that still carries weight. In my 17 years in Parliament, I have never known anger like it. She asked how a large-scale manufacturing outsourced outlet, dressed up as selling ware made in Stoke-on-Trent, could benefit Royal Doulton or North Staffordshire. She called for the Royal to be removed from the company's name. Mark Fisher, the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central, called for a DTI investigation. To see directors go away lining their pockets substantially, he said, while people who have worked for a company for 20, 30 or 40 years are left with nothing, offends the British sense of justice. Michael Fabricant traced the collapse back to 1997, to the blocked American acquisition, to the institutional investors who chose short-term returns over the company's future. Paul Farrelly described visiting a primary school where the subject of Royal Doulton inevitably came up. One of the teachers asked the children if any of their mums and dads were affected. In a Stoke-on-Trent primary school, that question didn't need answering. A government task force was established within 13 days. Advantage West Midlands, Job Centre Plus, Stoke-on-Trent City Council, the Ceramic Industry Forum, the Learning and Skills Council. European Social Fund money was approved, but there was no effective government intervention to prevent the closure. No DTI investigation was initiated, despite calls from multiple MPS. The machinery of support was assembled. The machinery of prevention was not. Manufacturing ceased in approximately April 2005. The factory formally closed on the 30th of September 2005. The Stoke Sentinel's front page ran a single headline. 2 words. The end. Martin Tideswell of the Sentinel recalled, "I well remember being on the Sentinel's news desk. Certainly, I recall the sadness I felt one day in April, 4 years ago, when workers at Royal Doulton's Nile Street factory clocked off for the last time. No documented ceremonial last firing has been found. No last figurine, carefully signed and dated, placed in a glass case. The absence is itself significant. When a pottery that has been firing kilns for over a century falls silent, you'd expect some kind of ritual, some acknowledgement. There was none that anyone recorded. The kilns went cold. The gates closed. And the silence that followed was the particular silence of a place built for noise. A silence in the wrong shape. What came next was almost worse. In November 1999, Waterford Wedgwood had acquired a 15% stake in Royal Doulton for £11.1 million. By 2002, they'd increased it to 21%. In February 2005, after the Nile Street closure had already been announced, they completed a £39.9 million takeover. Sir Anthony O'Reilly, Waterford Wedgwood's chairman, announced plans to invest $125 million to expand the Indonesian factory. On the 5th of January 2009, Waterford Wedgwood was placed into receivership by Deloitte, with debts of approximately €800 million. O'Reilly and his deputy chairman Peter Goulandris lost approximately €400 million trying to save the group. KPS Capital Partners, a New York private equity firm, bought key assets for £82 million, creating WRRD Holdings. KPS's managing partner Michael Psaros described what he found as the most completely shattered organisation we have ever encountered in over 20 years of business. Former employees at creditors' meetings were leaving in a state of shock. Many shortchanged to the tune of several £1,000s on redundancy packages. Bob Wilshaw, aged 58, of Abbey Hulton, who had worked for the Wedgwood Group for 42 years, was among them. In 2015, Fiskars Corporation of Finland acquired WRD for $437 million. A Finnish conglomerate now owned the name that a working-class pot thrower from Fulham had built with a £100 investment 2 centuries earlier. Chapter 10, Kiln Gate Demolition of the Nile Street factory, began in 2008. It was a protracted, phased process. Not a single dramatic implosion, but a slow erasure, building by building, wall by wall, lasting until approximately 2014. St Modwen, the developer that had acquired the site before the workers were even told of the closure, oversaw the clearance. An archaeological team from Oxford Archaeology documented what remained before the bulldozers moved in. The foundations of a massive Woodall Duckham continuous annular tunnel kiln. The ghost outline of the works that had shaped Burslem's skyline for over a century. St Modwen's original planning approval had included retention of Royal Doulton's principal historic building at the Nile Street entrance, and restoration of the courtyard as a business enterprise centre, creating roughly 400 jobs. That plan was abandoned. The later housing consent specified demolition of all remaining buildings. Every wall, every kiln base, every brick that had absorbed a century of heat and dust and human labour. A war memorial plaque that had stood outside the factory, commemorating workers who fought in both world wars, was believed stolen shortly after the factory closed in 2005. It was never recovered. Mike Lightfoot, who had worked at Royal Doulton for 2 decades, later told BBC Radio Stoke about that memorial. I worked with veterans on this site. I saw some of the lads with physical scars and a lot with mental scars that we didn't recognise that day. St Modwen promised to build a replacement. The original, the one the veterans had known, the one that carried the names, was gone. The factory is now a housing estate called Kiln Gate. 216 new family homes, 1 to 4 bedrooms, detached, semi-detached and terraced, in red brick designed to complement existing homes in Burslem. Prices start from £99,950 for a 1-bedroom flat. A small apartment block is named Doulton House. The factory gates were to be incorporated into the development. The Royal Doulton lettering from the factory shopfront was to be reinstated on a new building. Small gestures, echoes of what stood here, pressed into the brickwork of something entirely different. Where did the workers go? Into a city that was itself collapsing. The broader pottery industry shed tens of thousands of jobs across this period, from approximately 50,000 in 1983 to fewer than 10,000 by 2008, and roughly 5,000 today. Retraining schemes were offered through Job Centre Plus and the Learning and Skills Council. But what was available and how effective it proved remains poorly documented. What do you retrain a woman who has spent 30 years painting roses on bone china to do? What transferable skills does a man who can judge kiln temperature by the colour of the flame carry into a call centre? Tony Blore, made redundant in 2002, told the Sentinel, "I have some very good memories from my time at Doulton, but most of those are from my early years. In the last few years, I didn't enjoy going to work, and I still feel bitter about the way the management treated us." Tony Challoner, a China painter whose father, Ben Challoner, had been chairman of the Royal Doulton Art Society, helped establish the Burslem China Painters Group at Burslem School of Art. They staged an exhibition called Keeping the Skill Alive. He described the art of hand-painting pottery as if not dying, certainly endangered. The Heritage Crafts Association has since placed industrial pottery on its red list of endangered crafts, alongside skills like gold beating and lacework, traditions whose practitioners can be counted and whose future cannot be guaranteed. Chapter 11. What the name means. Now Royal Doulton still exists. The name travels the world. Under Fiskars, it sells tableware, cookware, glassware and home accessories, manufactured primarily in Indonesia and Thailand. Collaborations with Gordon Ramsay, Ellen DeGeneres and Terence Conran have replaced the HN figurines and the character jugs. There is no Royal Doulton Museum. The company's own FAQ confirms this. The official Doulton International Collectors Club was dissolved in 2008. Fiskars marketing emphasises 200 years of design heritage and claims the brand vision continues to be 100% British. The FAQ states that, like many luxury brands, they work with the best partners across the world. It doesn't say made in England, because by and large it isn't. Martin Tideswell of the Sentinel wrote what many in Burslem already knew. Burslem, a town I know well, has never really recovered from the closure of the Royal Doulton factory in Nile Street. It is no longer somewhere that people go to do their shopping. It has no supermarket, no indoor market, no big chain stores. The pottery industry once employed 100,000 people at its early 20th century peak. In 1938, half the workforce of Stoke-on-Trent worked in pottery factories. Today, approximately 5,000 remain in ceramics. Bet365, the online gambling company, is now one of the city's largest employers. A city that once supplied the dining tables of palaces now processes bets. But survival takes different forms. Emma Bridgewater still makes pottery in Hanley. Burley, at the restored Middleport Pottery in Burslem, saved with £9 million of investment and featured on the Great Pottery Throwdown, fires its kilns and opens its doors. Steelite International, spun off from Royal Doulton's own hotelware division in 1983, thrives. Portmeirion endures. Wedgwood maintains a small prestige production line at Barlaston under Fiskars. The British Ceramics Biennial, first held in 2009, has established itself as a major international event. Small-scale artisan potters have been drawn to cheap studio space in the 6 towns. The Made in England backstamp is becoming an increasingly valuable marketing tool for those who still make things in England. A statue of Henry Doulton still stands in Burslem Marketplace. He looks out over the town he came to as an outsider, the town whose scepticism he overcame, the town whose name became inseparable from his. The factory he built is gone. The kilns are cold. The paintress's benches are buried beneath the foundations of family homes. The Rouge Flambe formula, known to only 3 or 4 people at any time, is held now by whoever Fiskars chose to entrust it to, if they chose to entrust it to anyone at all. A company that survived cholera, 2 world wars, and a direct hit from a German bomb was dismantled by its own boardroom in less than a decade. The workers called it what it was: lions led by donkeys. The lions are scattered now, retired, retrained, gone. The donkeys moved on to other directorships. And somewhere in a shop or an online listing or a gift registry, someone picks up a piece of Royal Doulton tableware. They turn it over. They read the back stamp. And they see where it was made.